Welcome back to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Graham Richmond, and I am joined by my colleague, Alex Brown. How are you doing, Alex?
Great. Thank you very much for having me again, Graham.
Yeah, today we're going to talk about Wharton's team-based discussion, the TBD, which is basically what they use as part of their MBA admissions interviewing process. So instead of a traditional interview, they have this thing called the team-based discussion. We're going to tell you everything that you could ever possibly want to know about this process that they have, and probably even more than you'd want to know. And so, yeah, we have a lot of things we want to cover. But if you are thinking of interviewing at Wharton or are fortunate enough to actually have gotten an interview invitation, this is definitely the podcast for you. Before we dive in, Alex, I just wanted to do some housekeeping. I wanted to mention that we now have about 30 episodes of the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Podcast. It's a really great milestone for us. We're excited about that. Tens of thousands of you have listened to these podcasts, and Alex and myself and all the guests on the podcast are incredibly grateful for you all tuning in. We did want to ask you to be sure to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and to rate our podcast. It really helps us to get in front of more prospective MBA applicants and just to have more folks tuning in. So we really appreciate you all joining us. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Alex, who's going to kind of walk us through today's discussion on the Wharton TBD.
Thank you very much, Graham. And again, thank you for having me and welcome everybody listening today. As Graham suggested, I'm actually going to ask the questions. Graham will provide the insight and then I'll sort of follow up on some of that insight maybe. But Graham, let me ask you a little bit to talk about the history of the team-based discussion. So I think it's important contextually to understand how it's evolved, and why Wharton adopts this approach to help the students then prepare for their discussion.
Yeah, so Wharton used to have a pretty traditional, what I would call kind of blind resume-based interview. And those interviews used to be conducted by, second-year students or admissions officers off-site in hub cities or even alumni. So they had kind of, all hands on deck conducting very traditional blind interviews. The interviewer just had your resume. And then in 2012, they decided to do something quite radical. In fact, they were really one of the first schools to do something of this nature, certainly the first top school to roll something like this out. And they basically said, you know what, we're not really going to do individual interviews per se. We're going to do a team-based discussion where we take you, the prospective Wharton student, and put you in a room with four or five other fellow applicants, and we're going to give you some sort of problem to solve or discussion to have. And from that point, they obviously decided as well that given students' interest in having a little one-on-one time, they decided that they would also have a kind of one-on-one interview, which, it has a duration of about 10 minutes. So just so everyone understands, and we'll get into more depth on this, but the team-based discussion is like 35 minutes long. You're with a bunch of other candidates. Usually the group is no more than 5 or 6 in total. And then after the team-based discussion, you do have a one-on-one short interview with one of the folks that's overseeing the team-based discussion. But in terms of the history, the school just felt like they wanted to get more out of the applicants and learn more about candidates and how they sort of behave in a real in a setting that's designed at least to mimic the Wharton environment. And so they partnered with Carl Ulrich in the operations department at Wharton. He's the vice dean of entrepreneurship and innovation at Wharton. And they came up with this concept, which they rolled out in 2012. So it's been active for many years now. And, it was quite controversial at the outset, but in its wake, there have been a couple other schools who have attempted similar things. So you have University of Michigan has a team-based discussion. It's quite different from Wharton's, but that's sort of the history. They wanted to try to find a way to better assess candidates, and frankly, they got a lot of publicity out of it at the time, and I think it continues to be something that helps them stand out a little bit. So that's sort of the brief history of it.
It is quite an interesting approach and quite radical in terms of the difference from a regular blind-based interview, as you noted, that they used before. Prior to that, as you noted, Ross also has a team-based exercise. Ross's is optional, whereas Wharton's is required for those invited for an interview. So at Ross, you would have a regular blind interview, I think it is, and have the option to also have a team-based exercise. This is not the case for Wharton. Wharton's obviously using it maybe to showcase what the learning team environment's like at the school, to give a bit of the school experience through the admissions process. Graham, what do you think about this team-based discussion format? I mean, obviously we've been able to view it now for a number of years. We've engaged and interacted with candidates that have been through the process. What is your overall assessment of this change?
I know that Clear Admit has occasionally been accused of being Wharton friendly, right? Because I have an MBA from the school. I worked in admissions there. Alex, you spent, 7 years as Senior Associate Director of Admissions at Wharton. So we like Wharton, right? We're kind of affiliated to the school in some ways. But actually, we've always tried to be pretty objective, in terms of how we talk about the school. And I think people will find as we kind of dig in here that we are quite objective. I'm actually not a big fan of the team-based discussion. I think, before we kind of began recording today's podcast, I was thinking about, well, what do I like about it? And I think, what I like about it is that it really does approximate a learning team. So for those of you, for the uninitiated, as the Wharton MBA class is about 860 students, okay? And they divide those students into kind of groupings to make life a little bit easier because that's a big class. So they have what are called clusters, in which they have 215 students. And then further, they're divided down into cohorts, which have about 70 students. And you travel through the core curriculum your first year with that group of 70, having all the same professors sitting in a classroom with that group, basically. But what they also do, and this is, I think one of the hallmarks of the Wharton kind of curriculum, is they break you into these learning teams. And your learning team, you're with them for the entire first year. 5 or 6 kids, very diverse teams. Like they purposely set it up so that it's, got both men and women, people from the US and elsewhere, and a range of kind of backgrounds and skill sets. So they really craft these kind of learning teams. And I guess what the committee says it's going for in the team-based discussion is to kind of give you a glimpse into what it's like to be on a little team, with potentially your future students that you would be attending the school with. And so I like that aspect, right? They're trying to give you a real a sense of the flavor of the school. And so they're putting you in this group of 5 or 6. They're giving you a kind of question to discuss, and actually they give you the prompt in advance, so everyone comes into the discussion with some thoughts, and then you kind of get to spend 35 minutes talking through everyone's opinions and arriving at a sort of solution, or a kind of proposition for the observers. So that's kind of the positive, meeting, I'm saying, kind of learning team simulation and meeting potential future classmates. On the downside, I think we got to remember these actually aren't your classmates. I mean, Wharton only interviews 40% of the applicant pool, and of the people who get an interview, only like 1 in 3 make the cut and are actually going to be students. So the chances are, if there's 6 of you on this team-based discussion, only 2 of you are actually going to get into the class. So you're not really sitting down with future Wharton students. So that is a potential, kind of difference here. The other thing that I don't really like about it is it's competitive. It sort of puts you in a room. They're asking you to be, kind of friendly and do a sort of team project. Hey, no pressure kind of thing. But the reality is that it almost has, as I said, that only 2 of the 6 will survive. So it's kind of, I don't know that. So it may bring out sort of strange kind of incentives and behavior within the group, unlike a real learning team setting where, look, everyone's been admitted to the school. They all share the same goal, which is, get through the curriculum, graduate, et cetera, and learn, right? So there's some differences there that I think risk coming to the fore in a team-based discussion in which only 2 of the 6, it's like Survivor, 4 of you will be voted off the island kind of thing.
The other thing to consider too, Graham, would you agree it's a bit of a marketing play on the part of Wharton?
Yeah, that was going to be my next point, which is that every year, the team-based discussion prompt, it does change from year to year, but it's almost always something along the lines of, you've been tasked with creating a new program at Wharton that closely matches this current offering that we have. Or, in this year's case, it's about a team retreat at the end of preterm and how you might design that. And in all instances, anyone who's preparing for the team-based discussion is going to do their due diligence and look into the actual Wharton offering that this exercise is kind of based around. And so I feel like it's sort of like Wharton sort of forcing you to do some homework and learn about their program, which, I mean, look, granted, if you're interested in the school, you've probably done that homework anyway and you do like the program and are familiar with it. But it just has a whiff of kind of a marketing exercise. It reminds me a little bit of an essay that Columbia used to have, and maybe they still do. I haven't looked closely at this year's prompts, but they used to have an essay which sort of forced you to watch a video of a speech that the dean had given at Columbia, and then write an essay about, some sort of facet of that speech. And I always felt like, gee, is this them kind of showing off their, then highly charismatic and, personable dean so that you get excited about the school? What's the real purpose of this? And so that's my one hesitation with this, is that it does feel a little bit like a kind of marketing exercise.
Very good. That's a lot of background, I think, now that we've been able to provide for the TBD. So let's sort of get down and dirty with the exercise itself. Graham, what sort of general tips and best practices would you want to share with candidates?
Yeah, we have a number of those. I mean, I would say, remember, they give you the prompt in advance, so you've got to read it and think about it. And we'll get into this year's prompt shortly. But I think spend some time thinking about what would you say, because the way that these team-based discussions are formatted is that typically each of the participants gets to sort of offer a kind of opening statement, usually a minute or so, where they get to say, hey, I read the prompt, here's what I'm thinking. So everyone, you have to come in with some level of preparation in order to put out, your ideas. With that said, I think the first tip I would offer is don't spend, 20 hours researching and writing up notes around this. I mean, the key is to be familiar with the question, familiar with what Wharton's doing in the domain in which they've questioned you. So, for example, this year's question is about designing a kind of 3-day retreat for students to take part in at the end of preterm. And so, it's sort of like, where would you go? What would you do? What would be part of it? And we'll read the full question momentarily. But it just, so you need to come in with some ideas, right? At the same time, you need to be open to other people's ideas. And so if you come in having done 20 hours of research and writing on this topic, you risk not maybe being as open to others. And the fact of the matter is that your idea or ideas may not be the ones that people run with. And so, don't waste too much time preparing something, because you've got to be flexible.
And you want to back your ideas up too, right? So if you have an idea for a particular program, surely you want to then sort of support those ideas with some substance.
Right, because one of the things that they talk a lot about is critical thinking in terms of how the committee is assessing you. So it's not just do you get along with others, but it's like when you say something, have you backed it up? Is there critical thinking happening? Another kind of more basic tip that we often offer up is arrive early. I think this is not the kind of thing that you want to waltz into the room late for, right? I mean, because there are others involved. So you want to be sitting down in the waiting area at least 10 minutes early. The other thing that does happen, by the way, is that your fellow TBD participants are likely hanging out beforehand too. And I remember talking with some candidate who went through this process and said, it was actually really great. I socialized a bit with my team before we went in, and that kind of broke some of the ice, and we were more effective as a group. So arriving early is a good piece of advice.
I think that's a very good point. And actually, I read some of the Wharton interview reports from this season out of our interview archive over the last week or so. And I don't think you can underline this point too much. Arrive early, get to know your fellow participants before you're in that room, because it will help the flow and the dialogue of the TBD if you at least know each other's names. But a little bit of background would be sensible too. It was interesting, though, and we'll talk about this in a minute in terms of on-campus versus off-campus, but those that were interviewing off-campus, typically you knew everyone that was sat down waiting were going to be in your TBD. Sometimes in the on-campus scenario, there are multiple TBDs occurring simultaneously, so it's a little bit more tricky. And just finally, sort of back to this sort of first point of preparation, making sure you're aware that you're going to do a 1-minute pitch at the beginning of the TBD. So clearly you have to be prepared for that 1-minute pitch.
Absolutely. And then, other tips I would say, be succinct. participants you've got to give your 1 minute opening. If you take five, that's not going to go over well. And just in general, like don't, I mean, another related tip is like sort of don't speak just to hear yourself talk. Make sure that everything that you're adding to the discussion is in fact additive. And, other things that we talk about are keeping a close eye on the time, because you don't have a lot of time and you got to work as a group. Don't avoid disagreement. Like, I think constructive disagreements with your fellow participants is actually quite powerful in terms of being able to demonstrate that you can disagree with someone, but do so in a way that's completely polite and respectful.
And frankly, you might get asked in a business school essay, describe a conflict and how you overcame that conflict. So this is potentially a live potential for a conflict. So be careful with that. And again, back to reading some of the Wharton interview reports, this whole idea of timekeeping and keeping your pitch to a minute is not a trivial task. And some candidates really don't do that well. So make sure you're a candidate that does do that well.
Right. And, a couple other pointers in terms of these general tips, tip in some of the locations, particularly those on campus, there might be a whiteboard. People talk about how you can use it, but don't overuse it. And you don't want to make it such that only one person is using the whiteboard and then therefore they become the focal point, or, so you want to kind of keep things balanced. Don't overuse any of the tools. It's really about the discussion. And the last piece, we had some great feedback from the archive some time ago where someone was like, it was all about being authentic. And, some of this is great. This person said, everyone was bright and articulate, but there was not an ounce of truth in the encounter. I am a very positive person and leader, but I cringed as everyone offered artificial affirmations at every opportunity. Like everyone would say, great idea, when someone suggested that we take the caps off of our pens before attempting to write. It's like, it was just too much, right? Because I think most people say, oh, this is a team-based discussion. The committee's just going to be looking out for the kind of, the mean types who are, undercutting others, and so I'm going to be Mr. Nice Guy, and so, but you can go too far in the other direction, as this person describes. And this is that part of that dynamic that I think is a little challenging. I think another issue, if we go back to sort of like, what are the good things and bad things about a team-based discussion, is that I do wonder to what extent the observers, that is typically second year admissions fellows, so second year MBA students who are admissions fellows, if you're on campus, and sometimes admissions officers if you're off, I do wonder, like, if a group does really well together, does that sort of raise the stock of everyone in the group, even maybe unbeknownst to the person overseeing the whole discussion, right? So like, meaning it just like, if you have a bad discussion, does that make it harder for you to get into the program? Maybe even if your part of the discussion was fine, but the discussion just didn't go well because there were a couple of people who were stinkers or whatever. So there's this risk of like, people like, does everyone from the group get in or no one, kind of issue, potentially. I mean, the committee says they're on the lookout for that sort of stuff, but it is another potential concern. But back to the tips, those are basically, just running them down again. I mean, it's really, don't spend hours researching your topic, but be ready enough. Arrive early, be succinct, don't speak to hear yourself talk, keep an eye on the time. Constructive disagreement is not a bad thing. And then be authentic.
Yeah. Graham, is it important that your idea is the idea that the group runs with?
No. I think what's interesting is that everyone comes in to the discussion with an idea, right? At least, or maybe even several. And so I know that people kind of feel like, gosh, if my idea gets picked, maybe I'll be the one or one of the two or so that get in to the program. So they're often, people really cling to their ideas as the discussions begin. But you could actually do well to just be completely humble about the fact that, your idea maybe wasn't the best one, and kind of grab onto somebody else's idea and help articulate it, help tease it out, help get others to participate in the discussion. I mean, there's so many ways to be active and to have a successful TBD without, your ideas being kind of first and foremost in the discussion.
Yeah, and sort of having that self-awareness of recognizing a better idea and then engaging others to support the other idea has to be a positive affirmation of your sort of leadership skills and so forth. I would also add to this, though, is that you shouldn't be adopting someone else's idea because you didn't do the preparation for your own idea. right? So someone else may have a better idea than you, but hopefully that's not because you didn't prepare for the team-based discussion.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's tough because you do put some time into it going into the team base, but I mean, ideally the group arrives at a idea or set of ideas that is actually stronger than the individual ideas that any one person brought in, right? So that would be an ideal outcome.
Yeah, very good. So let's sort of switch gears just a little bit. Wharton offers this opportunity both on campus and off campus, and we've had conversations about on campus versus off campus interviews and how people should select. Why don't you give a quick sort of summary of how they should make that choice if they have to make a choice?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it is helpful to know that if you go on campus, there are a couple of factors. One is the observers, there are usually two for your TBD, will be second year MBA students, admissions fellows, and they'll be doing lots of these over the course of the season. If you do it off campus, you'll have admissions officers. And I think there are some subtle differences there. Obviously, admissions officers they're on the committee. They're there in the room when the final decisions get made, if there are any borderline, things happening, or they're voting and basically putting forth candidates for an acceptance. So one could argue that, wow, getting in front of an actual admissions officer has some value. On the other side of the equation, coming to campus can be of value. And, for example, they have a whole interview day agenda if you come to campus where you'll have obviously your team-based discussion at some point during the day, but during the rest of the time on campus, you can go to a class. That's only Monday through Thursdays, by the way, because there are no classes on Fridays, but you can go to a class. You can have lunch with current students, and you can do a student-led campus tour. So there are these different things happening on campus. If you go on Thursday night, Alex, you'll be pleased to hear they still have MBA Pub, and you can go to the pub at the end of the day too, and have a pint with Wharton students and really get some insight into the kind of social aspect of the program. So they're kind of pros and cons. I think. As you said as well, like the communities are smaller when you're off campus, right? So if you're interviewing in, Beijing or Mumbai or something, these are you're going to go and be in the waiting room maybe with some people that you saw at a Wharton info session earlier this year, or you're likely to be sitting in the waiting room with the very group that will be part of your team-based discussion. I think if you haven't been to Wharton and it's a school that you're interested in, it would not hurt to go. And I would almost argue that, to the extent that you can get there a day early or get some of the flavor of the school and the campus, it could also be useful in your one-on-one interview at the end, which we can talk about more too.
You actually raised an interesting point though, Graham, that I hadn't thought about before in terms of the team-based discussion. If you interview off campus in Mumbai or Beijing or wherever, you're likely to be interviewing with a more homogenous group of candidates with similar backgrounds versus if you interview on campus, where you're probably going to be in a team-based discussion that's slightly more heterogeneous in composition. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you interview in Mumbai, chances are, 99% of the people that you're interviewing with will be fellow Indian candidates. And, maybe even the gender balance might be different too than it would be on campus or something. So there could be, that's a really good point. I think that where English is not Mumbai is a bad example, but if we go to say Tokyo or the other, they go to, other markets that they're interviewing in, you get into kind of, well, how great is everyone's English? And does that somehow play a role in the fluidity of the discussion? So yeah, there are all kinds of things to take into account. I do think, going to Philadelphia is a nice thing to do if you haven't been to Wharton, but the school doesn't expect you to get on an airplane for a 35-minute team-based discussion, if that, to travel like 24 hours to get there for that. So, clearly they recognize, and that's why they come to these more far-flung markets in terms of, their distance from Philadelphia. So you're not going to be penalized either way, but we just want you to understand the differences between the two.
Yeah, very good. What about in your team-based discussion? You're going to potentially meet people with different personality types. One would assume Wharton sort of, has already selected these candidates from the application process. So hopefully they've selected good people and engaging people. But you may come across, someone that's very shy and won't contribute, or you may come across someone that completely wants to dominate the conversation. How would you advise candidates to deal with either of those personalities?
Yeah, I mean, you do make a great point. Obviously, only 40% of applicants get selected for the TBD. And so, in theory, you should have a nice group of, talented individuals. But, there are all kinds of personalities out there. And yeah, I think if you have a shy individual, I think the key is going to be, without losing your authenticity, as we talked about earlier, to try to, encourage that person to take part and tease out some of the ideas. And I mean, one easy thing is, because everyone has to talk at the beginning as part of the introduction and the introduction of their own ideas. If someone is kind of quiet and hasn't said anything since the introduction, your ability to they're going to give you a pen and paper. So your ability to kind of take some notes on what everyone said, and your ability to go back to that person and say, hey, you mentioned this. What if we combine this idea that you had with this other thing? Or, so figuring out ways to kind of incorporate that person without being the boss of everyone. You have to be good about it. But I think, obviously the shy person's probably not your worst worst case scenario. Obviously it's the person who tries to dominate, who, frankly, the jerk, if we're going to call a spade, it's kind of, there can be, people who are just, domineering, trying to really take over the conversation. We hear all about, mansplaining, or, there's all kinds of possibilities that could be happening in this kind of a discussion. So I think in that instance, you just want to be, able to interject and, in some cases, maybe even interrupt, but in a polite way. I don't think you criticize the person, but you can, say, hey, I really wanted to make this point, or it sounds like, so-and-so really wants to say something. Like, just being able to kind of keep an eye on the clock and the rough amount of time that people are sort of spending contributing to the discussion.
Yeah, and I think you make a very good point. When each person is doing their 1 minute pitch, take good notes, identify 2 or 3 key points from each person, so you can use those points to help direct and engage the conversation. And even in the case of when you've got a domineering personality, you can sort of redirect the conversation by picking, up someone else and their key points and trying to weave it into that conversation. So I think that you bring up a very good point there.
I think one last thing on this I was just going to say is that, remember, if the shy person is going to be shy and the domineering person is going to try to take everything over, you can make efforts to sort of mitigate that stuff. But at the end of the day, if the TBD goes by and the observer is like, wow, Alex did a really nice job of kind of not being too shy and not being a jerk like that other guy, like, that's not the end of the world either, right? Like, it's like there will be different personalities in your TBD, and your job is not to make everyone perfect, right? It's just but you need to keep an eye on this stuff.
Yeah. Very good, very good. So what about this year's question, Graham? Do you want to articulate it and just provide a little bit more insight in terms of directly addressing this question?
Yeah, I think that would be smart. So the 2018-2019 prompt, I'll just read it to you. It's short. It's, your MBA journey at Wharton begins with preterm, which is a 3-week MBA orientation designed to reacclimate students into an academic environment, provide team building opportunities, and establish a community framework for your MBA class. And then they go into a section just talks about how they break the class down. And I actually mentioned this earlier in the podcast, from 860 students down to these clusters of 215 and down to your cohort of 70. And then the main question here that they're asking you to contemplate is, for the purposes of this TBD, you have been invited to join a team tasked with developing a 3-day retreat, including travel, at the end of preterm for your cohort of 70 students. As a team, determine learning objectives, programming, and metrics for success for this preterm retreat. Provide opportunities for team building, social engagement, and personal enrichment while being mindful of logistics and location. So that's the question. And they, it's actually, when I saw it, I was kind of like, oh, this is fun. You get to kind of come up with how you end preterm with this little retreat for you and your other cohort mates. So it's just 70 people, which means you can probably get on a bus or, go somewhere. The fact that they mention 3 days, including travel, suggests to me, and at the end they say, while being mindful of logistics and location, suggests to me that this isn't like, hey, let's charter a private plane to Ibiza for the weekend. Like this is not that. I can tell you, having been through preterm at Wharton myself, and you probably remember this, Alex, from being on campus in the admissions office, I believe we went up to like the Poconos, like, 2 hours away or something, or somewhere in New York State.
Catskills, I
Oh, maybe
think.
it was the Catskills, New York State. It wasn't terribly far. We got on a bus and we drove up to this place, and we spent 3 days there. And we did all kinds of different, if you've ever been on a corporate retreat, I mean, there are a lot of similar types of, trust building, team building activities, a lot of social time. It was fun, and actually it was a bonding experience. And so I think part of this exercise, I think, is Wharton wanting you to get excited about, hey, this is cool. We do preterm, then we get this retreat, and we're just with the 70 people that we're going to be traveling through that core curriculum with. And so I think part of it's to get you excited. At the same time, they clearly want you to come up with like, okay, how would you, spend time? Like, what is the goal of this retreat? What are the learning objectives? What's the agenda? And how do you measure success? There are a lot of ways you can do any of these things. And I don't think, it's in my place or yours to kind of give people very prescriptive advice here. But I think the one thing that I did really want to call people's attention to with this question is I find it very interesting that they do not mention learning teams in this prompt. So they talk about how they divide up the class, from class to cohort, to cluster to cohort, but they don't talk about how within that cohort of 70, there are usually about 12 or 13 learning teams, maybe even 14. So, and the learning teams are very similar, as we talked about, to the TBD. They're 5 or 6 people, diverse group, and it's a critical piece of the Wharton experience because you literally do all your homework and assignments with these people for the whole first year. And I don't know if they left that out on purpose to see if you, the candidate, are going to come into the TBD knowing that there are learning teams and mentioning that, because the purpose of the retreat in reality, the retreat that they currently run at the end of preterm, is exactly that. It's to introduce you to your learning team. So you don't know throughout preterm, you're having a great time. You're, doing some classes and getting ready for the real academic experience, but you don't know who your learning team members are going to be. And you don't learn about that until you get to the retreat. And then at the retreat, you're put into your learning team and you spend a ton of time doing all kinds of activities together. So the fact that they left that out is interesting to me. I don't know if it's just because they want to, people to think kind of with a totally open mind and not, present something that's too similar to what exists now. But it is, they love the learning teams at Wharton, and it is a big, feature of the curriculum. So, yeah, so that's this year's question.
And I would suggest, obviously, as candidates think about this, to make sure that they answer the questions directly in their preparation. So they do determine some learning objectives, some programming, some metrics for success. So, for example, Graham, what would you consider a potential metric for success in this case?
I think this is maybe because I do a lot of survey work in my, we work with a lot of data at Clear Admit and work with schools and things. And so part of me right away was thinking about, you'd want to be able to survey the cohort at the end of this retreat and find out, how well they felt like they got to know their fellow cohort, what they learned about challenging team experiences or, ways to kind of navigate trouble. Because the fact of the matter is that no learning team or no kind of first year experience is perfect. And I think part of the reason for this retreat and orientation is to build some bonds that are strong enough to sustain some of the ups and downs of the first year experience, at any leading MBA program. And so there would be, I'd want to understand what people came away with. And I think, on some level, I know that they have meetings with learning teams, and there's almost like it's not like a crisis hotline, but there are many learning teams at Wharton and in other MBA programs that run into trouble. There's somebody not pulling their weight, or there's, somebody gets sick, or it could be anything that happens, or people just don't get along, or, there's always things that happen. And so I think you could also measure what's the incidence of those types of things post, over the course of the year based on everyone having attended this retreat, if the retreat is designed to give people the tools to cope with that stuff. So,
Right. Very good. Very good. After the team-based discussion, the candidate still does a one-to-one interview. Why don't you talk a little bit about that format?
yeah, so candidates, when they first introduced the TBD, were really worried that they wouldn't get a chance to kind of get some one-on-one time with a decision maker at Wharton. And so the committee has this 10-minute one-on-one interview at the end of the TBD. So you kind of go back to the waiting room, and one by one you go in and meet. Usually if there are two observers, they kind of split up, and they'll each do three of the team-based discussion attendees, right? So it doesn't take long, but you go in and you have 10 minutes, and usually it's a chance to talk a little bit about the TBD. So they might say, how did you think it went? What did you think your role was in the discussion? And then they quickly transition into, is there anything you want to tell the committee about your background? And do you have any questions for us? And so it's pretty open-ended, and it's incredibly short. I like to tell people, ideally they have, they're able to use this 10 minutes to kind of position their role from the TBD, but to not dwell on the TBD too much, so they can get into kind of some other discussion around their own background or questions they have about Wharton. Ideally, those questions allow them to, demonstrate a level of knowledge of the school and to dig deep, especially when you're talking to students, who could be, should be very well equipped to kind of answer any question you have about life in the program. So it's challenging. I personally, I'm not a big fan of such a short one-on-one interview. I think it's hard to get much out of someone in such a short period of time. But I know candidates have said they found it helpful at minimum to kind of sit down with the observer and to be able to kind of talk through how they felt the TBD went, what role they played, and then again to share a few things about their background and their interests in the school.
Yeah, and reading again the interview reports that we have, there is some variance in terms of sometimes in the one-to-one interview you're only asked about your profile and your why Wharton and those sort of typical blind interview questions, and sometimes you're asked about the TBD experience, but not always. So just be prepared for that level of variance. But Graham, finally on the one-to-one, let's imagine you had a very poor TBD experience. There was a dominating voice who wouldn't let go, and it frankly was horrifying. You go into the one-to-one, and the first question from the observer, who clearly observed this cluster, whatever you want to call it, how do you answer that question when you're simply asked, how do you feel the TBD experience went for you?
I think you want to be honest, but you want to avoid throwing someone under the bus, right? So, you can say, gosh, I think we had some good ideas. I would have loved to further explore A, B, and C. Unfortunately, it seemed like we kind of got bogged down here. So rather than saying, oh man, that was awful. Did you see that one guy who was, like you got to be sort of polite and constructive in your critique of it. Because frankly, I've been in this position of interviewing folks and know what it's like on the other side for the MBA admissions officer. And so have you. If someone comes in and is able to kind of constructively critique their own performance as a team, that's worth something to me. The ability to be able to say, because if you come in and say, yeah, I thought it was great, like that, you got to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of just self-aware, right? So, and your EQ, all these things that the committee's looking at. So, I don't think it's the end of the world if the TBD goes south a bit and then you get a chance to talk about that and why. I think that could show a real kind of wisdom on your part.
Yeah. And the key, like you said, is just don't throw someone under the bus. Nobody likes that in the context of an interview. Is there anything you think we've missed in this conversation, Graham?
I think we've tackled it. I mean, obviously, one of the things that comes up is, well, how do I write a thank you letter? And, we have admissions tips on like what goes in to a thank you. You can read those on our site. But I will say that even though you've done a TBD, you are going to sit down one-to-one for the 10-minute individual interview. And ideally, you get that person's name and their card and send them a follow-up thank you within 24 hours. email's totally fine, as I say. So yeah, that's just one thing that we didn't touch on. But otherwise, frankly, this is a tough interview to prepare for because there's all these variables that you can't control. You have as many as five other individuals in the room with you, and you have no idea what their thoughts are, what their background is, what their personality is. And so it's a real wild card, unlike, say, an HBS interview, which is a non-blind interview. You're going to sit down with an admissions officer, so there's consistency there, and they know your file inside and out. So you're going to have an in-depth discussion, but you can be ready for that. This is a little more challenging, but I will say that I know we've called it a little bit of a marketing exercise, but I think you got to do the homework. Look into what has Wharton traditionally done on these retreats. Maybe even read more generally about these types of activities and different things that can be done. In terms of programming and metrics and what you'd be trying to accomplish. So you can do some homework. That'll probably pay off. And yeah, just go in with an open mind. And I'd say it probably isn't helpful to go in thinking, oh, only two of us are going to make it. I think you go in thinking this is like a Wharton learning team. You've got to play that game and really assume that everyone in the room with you is terrific and has a strong chance of being a classmate of yours in the future.
Be prepared, be open-minded. Seem like two pretty important anchors to your advice.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we can kind of wrap things there. Again, this is probably more podcast minutes than have ever been devoted to a single school's interview. Although I guess we were close with HBS. There is a Harvard How to Interview at HBS if you're interested in that and fortunate enough to have an invite there. But yeah, we just want to thank everyone for tuning in once again. And we'll be back with some really exciting guests coming up on the podcast. I'm not going to reveal any secrets yet, but we've got some great stuff coming for you. So stay tuned to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions podcast. And Alex, thanks as always for taking part in this.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Graham, for having me. And good luck, everybody planning to interview at Wharton. We know it's a great place because we've both got direct experience with the school.
Yeah, best of luck to everyone. Thanks again.